Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello and welcome back to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned, where this week we're joined by Dr. Katherine Richardson, a world-leading Earth systems scientist, biological oceanographer, and one of the architects of the planetary boundaries framework, which is a scientific compass for keeping humanity within what we call a safe operating space. She's advised governments, chaired climate commissions, and led groundbreaking work on how life in the ocean shapes our climate. But she's not just here to talk theory. She's here to help us unpack what the planetary boundaries are, why they matter, and how science should and could guide real-world decisions, from climate policy to corporate strategy. Welcome to the show, Katherine.
Thank you very much, Felicia.
For our listeners who are new to the concept, what are planetary boundaries and why should we care?
You know, Felicia, before we throw ourselves at the planetary boundaries, I think it's really important to look at the context in which they've emerged. And I'm absolutely convinced that we as a society are beginning to realize that we have to manage our relationship with the planet as a whole, which is not really too surprising because our ancestors, when they stopped their nomadic life and began to live at a fixed address, I'm sure they let their waste fall wherever it was produced and they took whatever they thought they needed from nature, game and trees to burn and that sort of stuff. And then they realized, hey, we're getting sick from polluted water that's polluted by our own bodily products. We'll have to make some rules. We'll have to manage our relationship with these local resources. We're running out of game. We have to make some rules about not taking more than we need, not taking the pregnant animals, using every hair on the animal, and so on. So they developed local environmental management or environmental management at the local level. They didn't ever solve that problem. We're still doing it today. And when we got to be more, we realized that we want clean air and water in the UK. We can't let other countries use the water and the air that we use in a way that pollutes it. So we made regional environmental management. And what the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, I believe the biodiversity crisis is just as important as the climate crisis. What those crises are telling us is that for our own sakes, not for the sake of the planet. We don't need to save the planet. It's going to do just fine. But for our own sakes, we have to manage our relationship with the global environment. To do that, we need some kind of guardrails. We need to know how much pollution or damage or environmental effect is too much for our own good. If you think about it, when politicians say that we're not going to let human-caused global warming be more than 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, they're setting a global boundary, a planetary boundary for climate. But what we're saying with the planetary boundaries framework is that, hey, first of all, we're not sure the politicians got it right on the climate boundary, but there's much more than climate that we're affecting globally and that we need to manage our relationship to for our own sakes. So that's what the planetary boundaries is. Simply it sets guardrails for how much we can impact the global climate.
I suppose on one level, it's an organizational approach to how we manage those environmental issues, the way you were talking about, the dawn of the human age, because it's about saying it's not just a climate issue that shouldn't be transgressed. It's not just a CO2 limit, that everything feeds into the global commons in which we exist. And we pretty much haven't got anywhere else to go or anywhere else to get things.
Well, some people think we're going to Mars, but I'd rather work with where we are, to be honest. But yes, that's what the planetary boundaries is. The planetary boundaries is born in Earth system science. What is Earth system science? It's a relatively young discipline that understands the Earth as the complex system that it is. And in complex systems, just like your body, it's a complex system, or our families, or the socioeconomic system, they're all complex adaptive systems, and it's interactions within the systems that are really important. It's not just one thing. You can't eat only for getting strength. You also need to eat to get immune system and so on. So the Earth is a complex adaptive system, and it's our ecosystem. I think people are realizing today that we are a part of an ecosystem. It's really interesting because when science actually changes the way that we understand our relationship with the rest of the world, it can take a really long time before all of society is on it. Think of Galileo, who was imprisoned by the Catholic Church in 1633 for saying, I think Copernicus was right, and the Earth is moving around the sun, not the other way around. The Catholic Church didn't actually say sorry. They said there may have been some mistakes in the Inquisition. They didn't say that until the 1980s. It takes a really long time when something in science changes our way of thinking. And you can say the same thing about Darwin in 1859, who said, we're not any better than, we're products of evolution, just like all other organisms. We're not God's finest creation. And what we're doing at the moment, I think, is we're in a similar kind of an era where we're changing our understanding of our relationship to the rest of the world. And I think that started when we got pictures of the Earth from space. And you can see very clearly, we got them from the Apollo missions at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. And you can see very clearly from those pictures that the Earth does not have an umbilical cord. All of the resources that are necessary to support life, except energy, and we get that from the sun, but all of the rest are already here on Earth. And the fact that there's no umbilical cord tells us that when we use those resources, we're not going to get any more. It's sustainability, if you will, is really about making sure or developing a system where our demand for the Earth's resources is within the supply. And where you and I live, if everyone on this planet used resources the way we do in our countries, we'd need over 4 Earths, and we're not going to get 4 Earths. So the whole sustainability discussion is learning or developing systems to live within the limits, the resource limits that the Earth gives us. That's the environmental part of sustainability. The social part is how we're going to share those limited resources. And right now, there's less than 1% of human population that owns more than the 50% that's poorest. So we're not doing very well on that front either. And right now, there's a lot of focus on climate. But climate's a resource issue. It's a question of the garbage dump that we have in the atmosphere. How much more greenhouse gas waste can we allow ourselves to put into the atmosphere and still keep the Earth's average yearly temperature to below 2 degrees of what it was at the time of the Industrial Revolution? So when politicians set the planetary boundary and say 2 degrees, it's actually very easy to go home and say, how big is that garbage dump? We know it's over half filled. We know exactly who filled the first part. And the whole political discussion is who's going to get the rights to use the last almost half of that resource. And, some countries are saying, hey, we haven't had a chance yet. It's our turn. And other countries are saying, oh, no. We've already built up the infrastructure that's dependent on that, so we can't stop using it. So that's the sharing part of sustainability. So what we do with the planetary boundaries is we say, okay, it's normative in one respect. And that is, it assumes that changing the overall environmental conditions on Earth would be a really bad thing for humanity. Why does it do that? It does it because we've been here in our current biological form, humans, for about 250,000 years. That's 250,000 years. Not very long in geological time, but it seems like a long time from our perspective. We, biologically, as far as we know, haven't changed in that period. So there was no logical reason, why we couldn't have developed advanced civilizations far before we did. But in fact, absolutely everything we associate with modern civilization, and we're talking Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Neolithic Revolution, written language, everything we associate with modern civilization has evolved during the last 12,000 years. We call that period of time the Holocene. And what's interesting about that is until the Holocene, the Earth had been in a period where the climate was changing all the time, warm, cold, and the conditions were changing dramatically. What characterizes the Holocene, the last 12,000 years, is the fact that the temperature the average temperature on Earth has been incredibly stable. In fact, it's only varied by plus minus a half a degree centigrade in all of that period. And many anthropologists think it's that stability that actually gave the possibility or gave humans the capacity and to develop what they did, because they didn't have to focus on running around and staying alive. So we know for certain that our societies, our civilizations can thrive under the conditions that the Earth has had for the last almost 12,000 years, the period we call the Holocene. We don't know that we can thrive under any other conditions. So it would be very unwise of us to do something knowingly that could change the overall environmental conditions on Earth. Now, I should be upfront here, say one of the reasons, the major reason why it's been so stable during the last almost 12,000 years is the fact that the Earth's orbit around the sun is unusually circular. And you could say, well, that could change tomorrow, and so why should I worry about this? But there are these really boring scientist types that use their life studying the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and they say, hey, there's no sign that this is going to change for the next X thousands of years. And, that's long enough for me. So right now, barring a meteor hitting the Earth by chance or something, there seems no reason to believe that the overall environmental conditions on Earth would change unless we humans do something to do it.
We interfere.
Yeah. So what we do in the planetary boundaries is say, okay, we've got this complex system, which is our ecosystem. We're a part of that ecosystem. And what is it that's keeping it in these stable conditions? Well, first of all, there's climate. That's the amount of energy coming in from the sun and the amount going out. And we're trapping much of it with greenhouse gases now, so that's changing the temperature. There's climate. There's life, biodiversity. It's the interaction between life and climate, the energy balance of the Earth, that's actually created the conditions on Earth. And if you don't believe me, think about what would have happened without photosynthesis, getting oxygen into the atmosphere, which also gave us an ozone layer, which protects us against the sun's dangerous ultraviolet rays. So the interaction of biology and climate, or life and climate, is really the overall controlling or internal driver of the conditions on Earth, if you will. But there are lots of other things we do that affect the energy balance, things like damaging the ozone layer, putting particles, air pollution, putting particles into the atmosphere. And then there are other things that we do that affect biology, by removing water from the system, by putting pollution, chemicals into the environment, by increasing the amount or changing the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles on Earth, by acidifying the ocean, by putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, you acidify the ocean, and so on. So we identify these 9 different processes in this complex system we call home, and we try and say, how far can we push those? How far do we think we can push those without greatly increasing the risk that we will change the overall conditions on Earth? And how do we do that? Well, we look back at, how did these things work under different climate conditions, under different periods in the Earth's history. We can do that because there's a lot of good paleo evidence, not for things like pollution. That's relatively new. But basically, we try and understand the system and what these different processes mean. And based on how it's behaved under different conditions on Earth, we try and set a boundary or a guardrail for how much we should allow ourselves to push these different processes. Now, I should quickly say that being on the wrong side of a boundary doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be an ecological collapse or an environmental catastrophe. I look at the planetary boundaries as being like blood pressure. If your blood pressure's over 120/80, it's no guarantee you're going to have a heart attack or a stroke, but it does increase the risk. So we do what we can to bring it down. Currently, we're in a position, we believe, from our analysis of the planetary boundaries, we're on the wrong side of 6 of the 9 boundaries that we've set. That's the headline, and people get all worried about that. But to be honest, being on the wrong side doesn't worry me that much. We were on the wrong side, or at least very close to being on the wrong side of the boundary for the depletion of the ozone layer in the 90s. And because we got the Montreal and other international agreements, we're now very much on the right side. That's a good story. So being on the wrong side in itself isn't a sign of catastrophe. But for all of these 9 boundaries, we call them, or processes, all of these 9, you don't have to be scientifically educated to sit back and say, no, yeah, I could imagine a world where the climate is so different we couldn't be here. Or I could imagine a world that's so polluted that we couldn't be here. Or I could imagine a world where you can do this on all 9 of them. So we know intuitively there must be a limit. There must be a limit to how much we can change those and still live happily ever after. We don't know exactly where that limit is, but when we did our analysis in 2015, for all of the ones that we were on the wrong side of the boundary then, we're even farther on the wrong side of the boundary now. So even though we don't know with absolute certainty where the safe operating zone is, we do intuitively recognize there must be a limit somewhere, and we're barreling out of the axes on every one of these processes at the moment and increasing our perturbation of these processes. So we're in a really precarious situation at the moment.
So I think what's interesting to me about this is this idea that these boundaries have been set, and the idea that as long as we stay within those boundaries, we're in a safe operating space, that it's not the end of the world if we're on the wrong side, but what it is a signal to people, to companies and governments, that we're going in the wrong direction. And I think, I'm very interested in how that actually plays out in decision-making, in thinking about the ways in which we should organize society and organize responses. But I'm also especially interested in the interactions, because it's one thing to talk about what the planetary boundaries are, but what does it mean when more than one is transgressed? And how do those challenges interconnect? Because you mentioned biodiversity and climate. And obviously there is this growing acceptance and understanding of the fact that you really can't solve the climate problem without addressing the destruction of nature, the loss of biodiversity, the way in which we live. So I guess, can you talk me through how they interact, or if they do?
They definitely do interact. All of the boundaries do interact, but it's difficult to quantify. We don't know exactly how they interact, although we're getting better at understanding it. And one of the things, as you suggest, it's one of the things that we are beginning to realize, that we have a huge challenge in our sort of political attempts to deal with these issues, because we have climate over there in that corner, and we have biodiversity in that corner, and we have pollution here over in this corner. And there are interactions between them. And in fact, in our last planetary boundaries paper in 2023, we did some modeling work that said, hey guys, we cannot achieve the goals of the Paris climate agreement unless we stop and preferably reverse deforestation. But we still don't have an agreement on stopping deforestation, even though we're working on trying to get the climate. So we have these interactions. We know they're there. We have some of them in our climate models, but very primitively, because it's difficult. There are complex interactions, and we're not actually capable of converting them, translating them to a language, the mathematical language that allows us to model them accurately. But we recognize that they're there. And we're working very hard to try and be able to better quantify these interactions. We need desperately to have better models where the interactions between life and climate and all the things we're doing that are affecting life and climate actually come out in the other end. Right now, our climate models are basically physics with a few add-ons. And we've operated for a very long time in society with the idea that physics controls everything and biology rides on its back, but that's simply not true. It's this interaction between biology and physics which is so important, and that's what interests me most, and that's what my research is all about, is trying to understand this relationship between life and climate.
And that's what brings me to how you got into this. What drew you into studying biological oceanography? For our readers, what does that actually mean? And how did you actually end up focusing on the link between life in the ocean and climate systems?
Well, biological oceanography means I'm studying the ocean, and I want to understand the role of biology and the interactions between biology and physics in the ocean. What is it that makes there be more fish here than there? I mean, how does the ocean actually work? So that's what a biological oceanographer does. And I was happily doing biological oceanography oceanography. I had done an undergraduate at Harvard, gotten a Marshall Fellowship, and did my PhD in Britain. And I fell in love, moved to Denmark, and was happily working at a fisheries institute, trying exactly to figure out why are there more fish here than there, and looking at the tiny little plants that do photosynthesis, form the basis of the food web. Why are there so many? Why are they so active here? Why is there so much photosynthesis here and not over there? So that was what I devoted my life to. And I spent, until the 1990s, I was happily just going to sea and measuring this. And then I was invited onto the scientific steering committee of an international program called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. And I tell you, Felicia, the gods were in that scientific committee. There was Paul Crutzen, who got a Nobel Prize for showing the world how we were destroying the ozone layer. There was Bert Bolin, who was the first chair of the UN IPCC climate panel for the UN. I mean, they were just really. So it was a wonderful place to be and very, very stimulating. And they decided there were lots of different small projects in this program, and they decided to write a synthesis book. And the director at the time, Will Steffen, came with a proposal to this board about who should be on the writing committee subgroup of this whole thing. I should tell you, there were probably about 40 people in the committee as a whole, and we were only 2 women, and there were no women on his proposal. So Pam Matson and I waved our little paws in the air and said, "We think you forgot something." And sure enough, we ended up getting on the writing committee. And it was while I was on that writing committee when I realized that, hey, until now, I've been focusing on this little tiny part of the carbon cycle, how much carbon's getting into plants in the ocean and then getting into fish. And once it got out of the fish, I wasn't interested in it at all. And I suddenly realized, hey, this is part of something much bigger. And it's even related to climate. And so my little plants in the ocean are important actors in the whole climate development. And I was hooked. I've been doing this together with Will Steffen, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, and Johan Rogstrom and many others since the 1990s. And that's where Planetary Boundaries was born, is out of this aha realization that, this is an exciting system to work with and to understand.
I mean, it's a phenomenal story.
But I'm still working with both the Earth as a whole and the ocean. And right now the reason I'm not retired at the age of 71 is I'm doing the most exciting research project I've ever been a part of. We don't know anything. The Earth writes its history, but we haven't been able to read it. In the 1980s, people got proxies, or scientists realized you could use proxies to read what the climate's been like through time. Otherwise, we didn't know how much climate has varied in the Earth's history. So that's relatively new. Turns out, biology writes its story too. Life writes its story. And just the genomic methods, being able to find DNA in the genetic material in the environment, helps us to read that story. So what I'm doing at the moment is taking sediment cores out of the ocean. It's close to Iceland, where we have 2.5 kilometers of water in that region. And the organisms, when they die, they fall through 2.5 kilometers, and then they get buried in the bottom. And we take cores out and measure DNA, analyze the DNA in these cores. And in that way, we can describe what life looked like in the ocean over the last 600,000 years. So we can say how life has related, how it's changed in relation to climate, and possibly also how it has affected climate. So it's a really exciting time research-wise when trying to understand how this Earth, our ecosystem. I keep calling it our ecosystem, but I do that because in biology, we define ecosystem as being a group of organisms in contact with each other in a physical environment. And thanks to a global economy, we're in contact with every other human and other living organism on this entire planet. That hasn't always been the case for humans. We weren't always in a global economy. We had very local economies. So we had many ecosystems within which contained humans. But today, we have one big ecosystem, and we have to learn to respect and manage our relationship with that ecosystem.
It's incredibly inspirational to hear you talk about the research that you're doing and how these new things are still being discovered and what we're learning. But I'm also really interested in how that translates, because you talk about the human ecosystem, and we live within this globalized system, and every decision we make has an impact on everyone around us. How can we take that and use that for decision making? Because one of the things that fascinated me was learning that you helped design Denmark's 2050 fossil fuel free roadmap. What did you learn about how science can shape policy, and what are the challenges?
In contrast to many other people who don't think scientists are listened to, I'm convinced that science does help shape policy. But unfortunately, there's quite a long lag time often between scientific understanding and actually changing policy. I think policy is changing. I mean, look at the EU environmental and biodiversity and climate goals. In Denmark, we've just put a tax on farmers for their greenhouse gas emissions. You mentioned that I was chair of the Climate Commission in Denmark in 2010, which came with a plan for how Denmark can be independent of fossil fuels by 2050, and which is the plan which is being carried out at the moment. So we've now put a tax on farmers for their greenhouse gases. And the number one recommendation we had in 2010 when we reported was there should be a tax on CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions for all
Right.
Human activities or commercial activities, including farming. At that point, of course, the politicians and everyone said, no. But it's taken too long. So I do think that this science is really important for policy making. And I do see signs that there's much more systemic understanding of the need for systemic policy making. That, in Denmark, that's another thing we've just done in Denmark. We've developed a whole ministry called the Green Tripart Ministry, which is basically trying to solve the problems or the challenge of climate emissions from agriculture. It's trying to reduce the amount of agricultural land and make it into nature, and it's trying to protect water resources. So instead of having all of these things hiding in their own ministry, they're actually made a ministry that deals with the interactions between land use, water quality, and climate. So I do see signs both locally and also at the EU level. I guess we could possibly say as well at the international level, although that's obviously much harder. But certainly the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, that actually is trying to get an agreement that we want to have 30% of the Earth's surface, ocean and land, in some kind of protection for nature state, is a sign that there's this is also happening internationally. So it's definitely happening.
Yeah.
It's just that we're not all the same. This is a journey that we're all on, and we're not all on the same page in that journey. And I think there are very many corporations that are realizing that this is where we're headed. And so we need to prepare for a future where our values will be different, and we will be treating, instead of trying to maximize the immediate monetary payoff that we have here, that we're going to also have to factor in the interactions, what we're calling today externalities, in everything we do. And it's very interesting. I chair a high-level advisory committee in the EU on how research can be used for research and innovation, can be used to make countries more competitive. And it's really very interesting that our metrics that we use for assessing our financial situation are very short term. Usually they're historical. Well, last quarter went really well, or third quarter. And, we might try and say, okay, what do we think is going to happen this quarter, possibly a whole year? And we're really feeling brave. We look 5 years into the future, but with a lot of uncertainty. So our metrics for financial gain are really, really short. And yet if you go to the World Economic Forum or whatever, and you do these surveys, what do you think will be the biggest threat to finance or to the economy in 10 years' time? People say it'll be climate change, it'll be biodiversity loss, it'll be collapse of ecosystems, it'll be lack of resources. So we have this dichotomy that, people realize in the future, and, maybe it won't be 10 years, but I mean, they realize what in the future where we're, what's going to be happening. And we're measuring in these very short-term metrics. So one of the things we're trying to do in this group that I'm sitting with in the EU is to try and argue that there should, in addition to using the economic metrics that we have, we should be setting goals in the same way that we set climate goals for efficiency in resource use. The resources, as I say, are limited on this planet. How has life survived for 3.5 billion years without running out of resources? Because nature has made 100% circular economy. And that's something we have to be looking towards. And if you look at the increase in efficiency in labor use in the EU since the 1970s, huge increases in the efficiency of labor use, because labor is expensive and we recognize it's expensive. If you look at emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, also some pretty impressive increases in what we get out of the amount of greenhouse gases we emit. Energy, also positive, not as much, but still positive. Look at resource use, absolutely flat. There's been no increase in our efficiency of resource use since the 70s. And that has to change. So we believe that we need to have that companies, countries, groups of countries, trade agreements, whatever, need to be also putting some of these long-term perspectives in by setting goals for increasing resource use efficiency. Different companies with respect to the planetary boundaries were not designed to downscale to the company or country level. On the other hand, and they're certainly not designed to replace local and regional environmental management. They are to add another dimension for the global. So in themselves, they're not designed to be downsized. But if they're going to be useful for developing this management system with the planet, then we have to be able to use them at a lower level. And I think you easily can, because you identify 9 different areas that we need to be aware of. You can do a 360 and you can see where do we have these that have effects, and you can set goals for trying to reduce them. At the end of the day, however, this is all about ethics. I mean, how much is reasonable? How much land use, for example, is how are we going to use our land? That's a really limited resource. So that's something that we're all focusing on at the moment. Are we going to, and we have, some people grow gene-modified wheat in order to get growth hormones that you can put into creams to put on old ladies' faces so they don't have wrinkles. Are we going to use our limited land for that?
Yeah, it doesn't sound good.
Or are we going to use our limited land for making food? Or do we even need to use land to make food? Traditionally, we do it, but that's one of the areas where we actually have come a long way in terms of being able to use bioreactors to make the kinds of ingredients that plants make that feed us and give us energy. So we're going to have to do some really serious thinking, also ethical thinking about, if we're going to share these resources, should everybody have the same amount? Or should we grandfather countries that have traditionally used a lot and say you can continue to use a lot? Or the problem with recognizing that resources are limited is that you have to make some decisions about how you're going to share them. And the planetary boundaries cannot help you decide how to share them. The planetary boundaries can help you use them more efficiently and be aware of the effects of what you're doing, the potential effects and interactions on the system as a whole. But the planetary boundaries are only concerned with the environmental component of sustainability.
So really, we're talking about the fact that the planetary boundaries are they're an organizational approach that allows you to understand the collective impact of what we're doing and how that plays out at a planetary level.
That you need to be aware of in assessing your environmental impact.
Yeah. And we've talked about this issue of, sustainability being about materiality and what's actually happening. And then on the other side, this idea about what is a fair share? How do we divide responsibility? Who pays for what? What's fascinating about this is how much do people really need to understand about science? There is this belief, or there seems to be this belief amongst a lot of people, that they don't really understand climate science, so they don't really know what to do. And really what you're talking about is a different way of approaching the problem. I mean, do you think it really matters in order to affect change that people understand how the science works? What is it you think people need to know as a communicator about science? What do we need to know?
That's one of the really, really interesting things about universities for the last many years have been saying, go out, tell people about your science, communicate. Listen, I have been working for something like 50 years now to become an expert in what I'm an expert in. And I don't expect to be able in a 15-minute, 20-minute, half an hour presentation to get people to understand the science. I think it's very important that people, I almost always start my popular lectures with a picture of the Earth from space, because people know those, they understand them, they feel comfortable with them, they've grown up with them. They can, you point to the fact that there's no umbilical cord. I never thought of that, but of course there's not. Well, what does it really mean? Well, it means that, and every organism on Earth lives by using the Earth's resources. We've been trained to believe that what makes us rich is money. But in fact, nobody can eat money, nobody can put money on to stay warm, and nobody can live in money. So at the end of the day, it's the Earth's resources that are our real currency. And we need to understand that money is just a proxy for the Earth's resources. In the beginning, humans bought and sold from each other by trading naturalia. But then they realized, maybe Felicia doesn't need bread today. Let's give her some seashells. She can change for bread when she needs bread. And that became money. And for a very long time, we had gold as a standard behind our money, just to remind us that, there's something real behind this stuff. We dropped that. But we cannot drop the fact that it's the Earth's resources that are our real currency. And I don't think that's very hard for people to understand, with or without a science background. So I think it is possible to convey the urgency and the importance of changing our ways by simply working with the tools that we all have around us.
I think one thing that does call into question, because I think your point about money is really, really important. But do you think that we can stay within the planetary boundaries? Can that approach of sort of collective management of the resources we have, does that actually coexist with the economic system we've got, which, as you mentioned earlier, doesn't include externalities like pollution or extraction or whatever it might be? Or do we need to look at things differently?
Let's start in another place. I think definitely it cannot exist with the economic values that we have at the moment. But I see those values changing. I do some consultancy for various groups, including financial people, and it's interesting. It's the family funds that get this, and because they want to make sure that their money works for their children and their grandchildren. And so they are willing to say, okay, we don't have to have the biggest return today because we want to have a return in the future as well. And I think this is slowly coming to the rest of the financial system as well. I don't think that we're going to wake up one morning and say, oops, the finance, the economic system, our models didn't work. Let's just drop them and find something else. I mean, that isn't going to happen. We're going to have to adapt what we have to what we need. And what we're missing at the moment is financial or economic policies that actually reward the behavior that we know we need to have. And that's why I think it's so fascinating that we finally in Denmark have put a tax on farmers for the greenhouse gases that they're emitting. It was framed in the discussion and, the debates around it that, people were trying to get a shovel in and under the farmers. But no, this isn't about trying to hurt the farmers or do anything to the farmers. It's about trying to get our economic system to encourage, support, pay for the behavior that we know we need to have. And I think we need to be seeing more of this. I think we will be seeing more of this. Quite honestly, I think we're going to have to get our trade agreements, given that this is a global product. It's a consequence of having a global market. I think in order to fix it, you're going to have to get global trade agreements in on it as well. And right now, this isn't the way it's looking. And given the turmoil, the sort of geopolitical turmoil at the moment, it might be a good time to start rethinking things and doing things differently. Because as long as things are working, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right now, we're in a position where it looks like our normal rules and expectations to international trade, international relationships aren't working. And so we're going to have to build something new. And I think it might be an absolutely ideal time to try and bring some of these resource considerations into the new system that we're building up. Just saying, I think it will come.
I read that one of your sort of responses to what we're talking about as the climate crisis is this idea of cooperate, cope, compete, or collapse. Is that where you think we are today? Is that what will drive the change in the system? And I suppose, especially when thinking about the younger generation, what gives you hope? Because I think that is something which young people at the moment seem to really be lacking.
What gives me hope is the fact that I do feel change around me. There's not very many good things you can say about getting old, but you do have experience on your side. And I can tell you that, when I get up and share the stage with politicians or corporate executives today, we're all saying the same thing with different languages. We weren't doing that 5 or 10 years ago.
Right.
So I do feel that change is in the air. That gives me hope. But I'm concerned that it's far, far, far too slow. What gives me hope there is the fact that, I'm a natural scientist. I work with things like tipping points and when are we going to lose the Arctic sea ice and all that sort of stuff. But there are not only natural science tipping points. There are also social science tipping points. There are tipping points in our society. And I'm also old enough to have lived through some of them. The change in our relationship to smoking. I promise you, I did not have a seatbelt on when I was a small child in the car. My mother just put her hand out and tried to hold me back when she stopped suddenly. So there are lots of things that suddenly change very, very quickly in society. And sometimes in my more optimistic moments, I feel that we may well be in the middle of a social tipping point. I think with respect to energy transition and transition to green energy, we're definitely in a tipping point. Over half of the cars sold in Denmark last year were electric. Over 90% of the cars sold in Norway are electric. The investments that are being made, I mean, what China has invested in green energy is mind-boggling. And I think that's going to happen. And it's interesting because journalists come to me and say, Trump's been elected, and Trump's saying, listen, 78, now 79-year-old man isn't going to stop the green energy transition. Not going to happen because it's so embedded, and it is happening. Now, a green energy transition in itself is going too slowly, but that's the thing about tipping points. It goes slowly at first, and then it can go very, very fast. But energy isn't the only thing we have to worry about. Energy is clearly important. We're interesting because we're the only organism on Earth that has learned to harness external energy to our own use. And so we're very focused on that. And and when we talk about an energy crisis, we talk about this luxury energy, the ones that makes our machines work, the ones that keep us warm, the ones that transports us. But in fact, the most interesting energy is the energy that keeps us alive. And that's energy that comes from the sun. But you and I aren't smart enough to use that energy directly to survive. We can use it to warm our house, but we can't eat it. We need plants to do that job for us. And so it's interesting, in our planetary boundaries, we've calculated that the energy that keeps all animals on Earth alive is what gets captured in plants. And right now, we are using, for our own purposes, a third of that energy that was available to both to us and to all the other animals at the time of the Industrial Revolution. We're taking over, or around a third of it now. And yet we're saying, oh, we want more biomass. We want biomass for heat. We want biomass for making plastics. We want biomass for this and that and something else. And we have to recognize that is a limited resource. We can't do photosynthesis ourselves. We haven't learned to. So again, we're going to have to focus on how do we use the plant material that nature is creating as efficiently as possible. And could we possibly increase the amount by helping plants to do photosynthesis places where they've never done it before, like on roofs or in bioreactors or in the ocean or whatever? So that's the really interesting energy, and we haven't really been thinking about it.
And I think there's a wonderful element there, which is that there's a lot of conversations in the climate space around education and knowledge, and it's often not knowledge that leads to action. It's understanding what it means to you. And I think if we can make that connection, it's very, very powerful. And I think that's your point about the potential for social tipping points is a really hopeful thing and a wonderful thing to think about, because if we can actually affect the changes we need, then we get to stay within the planetary boundaries, which is a pretty good thing for all of us. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think I should have done?
I think we could actually push this social tipping point thing a little bit more, because this is the reason why I do podcasts. This is the reason why I give over 100 popular lectures every year to various, both important people, policymakers, companies, so on, but also to folk dancers and my neighbors or whoever, the local church, is that it turns out with these tipping points that once you get to a certain percentage, and it doesn't have to be a huge percentage, something between 15 and 30% of a group that wants something to happen, it's going to happen. It'll take time and there'll be bumps on the road. I think we have to respect the fact there'll be bumps on the road. So there will be setbacks. And, the geopolitical situation at the moment is absolutely a setback for the whole climate and sustainability agenda. But the sustainability agenda isn't a nice to have. It's a need to have. We know that because we can see that life has only been able to survive on Earth for 3.5 billion years because it's made 100% circular economy. So we don't need all that many people we don't need a vast majority of the people to believe we're going to have a change to make just enough. And there it's important that people don't change their thinking and their way of doing things because I, as a scientist, come along and show a lot of PowerPoints and explain it all to them. They do it because their tribal leaders do it. It could be their church leaders. It's the people they look up to. It can be the rock stars or whatever. And so I think it's important that people in the tribes that they belong to are able to communicate this and do communicate that sustainability isn't a nice to have that somebody else is going to figure out for us. It's a need to have, and we all have a responsibility in making sure we get there.
And can I say thank you for putting that so beautifully, because it's wonderful to be able to take something as potentially abstract or macro as the planetary boundaries and actually bring it back down to the fact that it's just about people. And it's about the choices we make and how we choose to move things forward. Katherine, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating listening to you. To our listeners, I hope you've learned something, enjoyed what you've heard, and I'll be adding some details in the show notes just about places you can do your own research. Thanks again, Katherine, and we'll be back soon.